September 20, 1946. Henry Wallace stared at the telephone in his Commerce Department office, his hand still gripping the receiver long after the call ended. President Harry Truman's voice had been calm, almost courteous, but the words cut like a knife. Effective immediately, Wallace was out. Fired from the cabinet. This wasn't just any dismissal, it was a seismic betrayal for a man who had been Franklin D. Roosevelt's trusted right hand, the vice president who shaped wartime policy and dreamed of a peaceful post-war world. Wallace had traveled the globe on FDR's behalf, from Latin America to the Soviet Union, forging alliances and envisioning a future free from the shadows of conflict. Now, reduced to nothing by a president he viewed as an unqualified interloper, Wallace felt a fire ignite within him. He wasn't done. Far from it. This moment would launch a relentless 2-year crusade to expose what he saw as Truman's dangerous path toward another world war. One that could eclipse the horrors of the Second World War he had just helped end. To understand Wallace's fury, we must rewind to his roots and rise. Born in 1888 on an Iowa farm, Henry Agard Wallace wasn't born into politics. He revolutionized agriculture first. As a young scientist, he pioneered hybrid corn, boosting yields that fed millions during the Great Depression and the war. His innovations earned him respect, leading to his appointment as Secretary of Agriculture under FDR in 1933. Wallace's progressive vision aligned perfectly with Roosevelt's New Deal, fighting for farmers, laborers, and civil rights. He openly denounced racial segregation in the South, a stance that made enemies among conservative Democrats but endeared him to liberals and minorities. By 1940, FDR handpicked him as vice president over party bosses' objections, threatening to quit his own re-election bid if Wallace wasn't on the ticket. Wallace became one of the most active VPs in history, chairing the Board of Economic Warfare and embarking on diplomatic missions that deepened his belief in international cooperation. Wallace's worldview was shaped profoundly by his 1944 trip to the Soviet Union. Touring Siberia, including Magadan and the Kolyma region, he witnessed what appeared to be thriving volunteer labor camps, well-fed workers building a socialist utopia. Unbeknownst to him, these were disguised gulags, part of Stalin's brutal system where millions suffered. NKVD agents had orchestrated the facade, even planting flowers and staging performances. Wallace returned convinced that Stalin was a pragmatic leader open to partnership if met with trust, not suspicion. This optimism clashed with emerging realities: Stalin's broken promises at Yalta, rigged elections in Poland, and the systematic control of Eastern Europe. Yet Wallace held firm, terrified by the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which he saw as harbingers of mutual destruction. By 1944, with FDR's health failing, party leaders panicked at the thought of Wallace ascending to the presidency. They viewed him as too idealistic, too sympathetic to unions and civil rights, and dangerously naive about the Soviets. At the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, a fierce battle unfolded. Wallace had strong delegate support and passionate backers chanting his name. But bosses like Chicago Mayor Ed Kelly intervened, citing a fabricated fire hazard to adjourn the session mid-uproar, buying time to rally against him. FDR, weakened and pragmatic, played both sides, penning a letter endorsing Wallace personally while signaling acceptance of alternatives like Truman or Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas. On the second ballot, Truman, a mild-mannered senator from Missouri tied to the Pendergast machine, clinched the nomination. Wallace was devastated, seeing it as a coup by reactionaries who feared his progressive agenda. Roosevelt's re-election offered Wallace a consolation: Secretary of Commerce. But FDR's death on April 12, 1945, thrust Truman into power. Wallace, now serving under the man who had supplanted him, seethed with resentment. Truman, a former haberdasher with scant foreign policy experience, having met FDR only twice as VP, seemed ill-equipped to carry Roosevelt's torch. Cabinet meetings became torturous for Wallace, who measured every Truman decision against FDR's ideals. The rift deepened over the Soviet Union. Wallace advocated good faith and cooperation, drawing from his Siberian insights and a deep-seated fear of nuclear Armageddon. Truman, influenced by George Kennan's long telegram, adopted containment, resisting Soviet expansion through strength, not concessions. Tensions boiled over in private memos and ignored pleas. By early 1946, Truman's firmness, evident in responses to Soviet actions in Iran and Germany, alarmed Wallace. He saw it as provocative warmongering, betraying FDR's vision of collective security through the United Nations. Desperate to avert catastrophe, Wallace went public. On September 12, 1946, before 20,000 at Madison Square Garden, he delivered a bombshell speech cleared vaguely by Truman's staff. Contradicting Secretary of State James Byrne's tough negotiations in Paris, Wallace urged trust toward the Soviets, framing their Eastern European moves as defensive. He warned that U.S. atomic monopoly bred paranoia in Moscow and pushed the world toward war. The crowd erupted in approval, but the backlash was swift. Burns threatened resignation, the press decried cabinet disloyalty, and Truman, caught off guard, initially claimed approval before backpedaling. Wallace stood firm, invoking FDR's name and demanding policy debate. For Truman, this was insubordination laced with betrayal. The firing call came, freeing Wallace to unleash his full assault. Freed from cabinet constraints, Henry Wallace wasted no time. The very next day after his firing, he stepped before a swarm of reporters and declared his mission: to awaken the American people to the peril of Truman's foreign policy before it dragged the nation, and perhaps the entire world, into another catastrophic war. He spoke with the quiet intensity of a man who believed he alone carried the true torch of Franklin Roosevelt's legacy. What followed was an extraordinary, almost unprecedented campaign. A former vice president systematically attacking a sitting president from within the same party, using every platform available to him. From late 1946 through 1948, Wallace crisscrossed the country, delivering hundreds of speeches in packed union halls, college auditoriums, and city squares. In Detroit, thousands of auto workers cheered as he warned that Truman's "get tough" attitude was manufacturing enemies instead of building peace. In Chicago, he told a crowd of war-weary veterans that another global conflict was not inevitable. It was a choice being made in Washington. In Los Angeles, he drew families who still remembered ration books and blackout curtains, promising them a future where trust replaced suspicion. His message was consistent and emotionally powerful. America held the power to prevent World War III, but only if it chose cooperation over confrontation. Wallace's core argument rested on a single haunting fear. The mushroom clouds over Japan had shown humanity what total war now looked like. He believed the atomic bomb had changed everything. No nation, not even the Soviet Union, could afford another world war. Therefore, Stalin's actions in Eastern Europe, harsh as they appeared, were defensive reflexes against perceived American hostility. If the United States would lower its guard, share atomic knowledge through the United Nations, reduce military spending, and withdraw troops from overseas bases, the Soviets would respond in kind. It was a vision of radical optimism rooted in terror of annihilation. The crowds responded with desperate hope. Many Americans were exhausted by years of sacrifice. They wanted to believe peace was still possible, that the wartime alliance with the Soviets could be revived rather than replaced by permanent enmity. Wallace became their voice. Polls began showing cracks in Truman's support among liberal Democrats, union members, and urban voters, precisely the coalition FDR had built. Wallace wasn't winning elections yet, but he was eroding Truman's base with surgical precision. Behind the scenes, however, darker currents were moving. Soviet propaganda outlets, Radio Moscow, Pravda, and international communist publications, began quoting Wallace extensively. Entire passages from his speeches appeared verbatim in Moscow newspapers. Soviet diplomats praised his courageous stand for peace. Wallace saw this as validation. If even the Soviets recognized the wisdom of his position, surely he was right. Critics, however, saw something far more troubling. American intelligence agencies quietly documented that several organizations funding and organizing Wallace's speaking tours had documented ties to communist front groups. Some of his closest advisors had past or present connections to Soviet-aligned networks. Wallace himself remained fiercely independent. He never joined the Communist Party, never took orders from Moscow, but the optics were devastating. His message, however sincere, was being amplified and weaponized by the very power Truman was trying to contain. In March 1947, Truman went before Congress and announced what history would call the Truman Doctrine. He asked for $400 million to aid Greece and Turkey against communist insurgencies, declaring that the United States would support free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. It was the formal birth of containment as national policy. Wallace's reply was blistering. He called it a declaration of Cold War, an open step toward American empire building under the guise of anti-communism. He accused Truman of abandoning the United Nations and Roosevelt's dream of genuine collective security. To Wallace's followers, the speech felt prophetic. To mainstream Democrats, even many who questioned containment, it felt dangerously irresponsible. Then came the Marshall Plan in June 1947. Secretary of State George Marshall proposed a massive economic recovery program to rebuild Western Europe, preventing economic collapse that could open the door to communism. The plan won overwhelming public support and enthusiastic backing from European governments. Wallace denounced it as economic imperialism, a scheme to encircle and isolate the Soviet Union rather than include it in post-war reconstruction. His opposition placed him increasingly outside the mainstream. Even liberals who had once admired his idealism began to see him as rigid and out of touch. By December 1947, Wallace made his boldest move yet. He announced he would run for president in 1948 under a new Progressive Party banner. The platform was uncompromising: immediate negotiations with Stalin, withdrawal of U.S. troops from Europe, international control of atomic energy, including sharing knowledge with the Soviets, dismantling overseas military bases, and ending economic aid conditioned on anti-communist alignment. It was, in effect, a mirror image of Soviet foreign policy goals. Wallace knew he could not win the White House. Third-party candidates rarely did. But he believed he could force Truman to moderate his stance, or, failing that, split the Democratic vote enough to hand the election to the Republicans, teaching the party a lesson it would never forget. The announcement electrified his supporters and alarmed the political establishment. Soviet media rejoiced. Communist parties across Europe endorsed him. Wallace welcomed the backing, insisting that anyone committed to peace belonged in his coalition. That decision proved fatal to his broader appeal. Liberal Democrats who might have sympathized with his call for détente recoiled at the communist associations. Truman's advisors seized the opportunity, framing Wallace not as a misguided idealist but as a useful tool of Moscow. The label stuck. Still, Wallace pressed forward. His rallies drew thousands. His poll numbers hovered between 10 and 15%, almost entirely siphoned from Truman's base. In key industrial states like New York, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, analysts warned that Wallace could tip the balance toward Republican Thomas Dewey. By summer 1948, the Democratic Party appeared on the verge of disintegration. Southern segregationists had already bolted to form the Dixiecrat ticket. Wallace was pulling liberals leftward. Truman seemed doomed. The summer of 1948 looked like the end for Harry Truman. Every major poll showed him trailing Republican Thomas Dewey by double digits. Newsweek asked 50 of the country's top political journalists who would win. All 50 picked Dewey. The Chicago Daily Tribune went to press with the infamous headline, "Dewey defeats Truman," before the votes were even counted. The Democratic Party was splintering in three directions. Southern segregationists ran Strom Thurmond on the Dixiecrat ticket, liberals flocked to Henry Wallace's Progressive Party, and the remaining core struggled to hold together behind a president most insiders had already written off. Wallace's campaign, though doomed to lose, had achieved its narrow tactical goal. He was bleeding enough liberal and labor votes in pivotal industrial states to make Truman's defeat seem mathematically certain. Then history intervened in ways no pollster could predict. In February 1948, Czechoslovak communists, backed by Moscow, staged a ruthless coup. The last democratic government in Eastern Europe vanished overnight. Jan Masaryk, the pro-Western foreign minister and son of the country's founder, fell, or more likely was thrown, from a window in Prague. The event sent shockwaves across the United States. It was impossible to spin as a defensive Soviet move. It was naked power seizure. Then, on June 24, 1948, Soviet forces abruptly blocked all road, rail, and canal access to West Berlin. 2.5 million people were suddenly cut off from food, medicine, and coal in the middle of winter. Truman's advisors urged evacuation. He refused. Instead, the United States and Britain launched the Berlin Airlift, an unprecedented logistical miracle that delivered more than 2 million tons of supplies over 11 months, one plane landing every few minutes around the clock. The images of American pilots dropping candy to German children became a global symbol of resolve. Stalin had miscalculated. The blockade, intended to force the West out of Berlin, instead united Western opinion and exposed Soviet aggression in stark terms. These back-to-back crises demolished the foundation of Wallace's entire argument. He had spent 2 years insisting that Soviet actions were defensive reactions to American hostility, that Stalin would reciprocate if only the United States showed trust and good faith. Czechoslovakia and Berlin made that position untenable. Stalin was not waiting for American provocation. He was actively dismantling democracy and testing Western will. Wallace's poll numbers, which had hovered between 10 and 15% for much of the year, began to collapse. By autumn they had fallen below 5%. Many former supporters quietly drifted back to Truman, concluding that idealism, however noble, could not survive contact with reality. On Election Day, November 2, 1948, Truman pulled off the greatest upset in American political history. He won 303 electoral votes to Dewey's 189. Wallace received just 2.4% of the popular vote, about 1.15 million ballots, and carried not a single state or electoral vote. The Progressive Party collapsed almost immediately afterward. Truman's victory was not only personal, it was a vindication of containment at the precise moment when the policy's necessity was clearest. The Korean War, which erupted on June 25, 1950, delivered the final blow to whatever remained of Wallace's credibility. North Korean forces, armed and encouraged by Stalin, invaded South Korea in a blatant attempt to unify the peninsula under communist control. Truman acted swiftly, securing a United Nations mandate and committing American troops. The war proved everything Truman had warned about Soviet intentions. If the United States had followed Wallace's platform, withdrawing from Asia, sharing atomic secrets internationally, dismantling overseas bases, South Korea would almost certainly have fallen within weeks, and Japan would have been left dangerously exposed. In the face of undeniable aggression, Wallace issued a brief, subdued statement supporting Truman's decision to defend South Korea. It was the closest he ever came to a public retraction. Privately, friends said he was shaken. The man who had once described Soviet labor camps as models of humane socialism now confronted evidence that Stalin was willing to unleash full-scale war to expand communist power. By 1952, Henry Wallace had largely withdrawn from public life. He returned to farming, writing occasional articles on agriculture and world affairs, but never again mounted a serious challenge to American foreign policy. In 1952 he published a piece in This Week magazine titled, "Where I Was Wrong." He admitted he had been naive about Stalin's aims, acknowledged that some groups backing his 1948 campaign had been communist-controlled, and conceded that containment had prevented worse disasters. Yet he stopped short of a full reckoning. He never fully grappled with how deeply his crusade had aligned, however unintentionally, with Moscow's objectives, or how close he had come to fracturing the Democratic Party at the dawn of the Cold War. Henry Wallace died on November 18, 1965. Most obituaries remembered him as FDR's progressive vice president, the father of hybrid corn, and a lifelong advocate for peace and economic justice. Few dwelled on the 2 years he spent trying to bring down Harry Truman. Those who did often framed it as a tragic misjudgment born of sincere conviction rather than malice. Wallace was not a traitor. He was a man so horrified by the possibility of nuclear war that he convinced himself cooperation with Stalin was still possible long after the evidence proved otherwise. His story is a cautionary tale about the seductive power of hope in the face of uncomfortable facts. Wallace looked at the most ruthless dictator of the 20th century and saw a potential partner because the alternative, a permanent state of armed rivalry between superpowers, was too terrifying to accept. He was wrong, catastrophically so, but his error was rooted in the deepest human instinct, the desire to believe that peace can be chosen, even when the other side has already chosen something else. In the end, Harry Truman's stubborn, unglamorous realism carried the day. Containment held the line for 4 decades until the Soviet system finally collapsed under its own weight. Wallace's dream of cooperation died quietly, overshadowed by the very history he had tried so hard to shape. Sometimes the path to peace is not the one that feels most compassionate, it is the one that stares clearly at reality and refuses to look away.